alas. Okay. Good morning. My name is Azja. Very excited to talk to you this morning about blackness, capitalism, and property. Hopefully you have some questions or some key things that you came into this lecture with or wanting to know. I will try to get to all of them, but these are very complex concepts that are all very intimately interconnected, and require a lot of like revisiting and research to really understand fully. So if you leave this lecture being like, I'm so confused, also / am I the problem? It's okay, we've all been there and it's fine. Alright, so our objectives. By the end of today's lecture, ideally we will define some key terms in hopes of developing a language for understanding capitalism as a superstructure that affects any and all beings situated within it. We will then contextualize intellectual property within capitalism and anti-blackness. We will discuss how one might apply learned concepts within broader debate contexts, i.e. race and gendered Ks of property, or ownership and power. Are there any questions about the objectives for today? Amazing. Questions, ask them. I have ADHD. I think I've started every lecture I've given about just like this, but I forget things. So do not be like, I don't want to interrupt her. Please do, because I will forget the context of the thing that I said, or when I said it, and how I said it, and in relation to what I said it next to. So just ask me in the moment instead of waiting at the end, because you'll be like, oh, this thing you said before, and I'll be like, maybe I'll remember, maybe I won't. Not a risk that either of us wants to take. Amazing. Capitalism. Going to my notes. When the means of production, i.e. land, factories, machines, resources, etc., are privately owned by the bourgeoisie. What is the bourgeoisie? Tyson.
Like an upper class.
Sure, an upper class, the people owning all of the things. Common phraseology that we hear, you might hear people say like the 1%. That would be like the highest of the bourgeoisie. Common misconception is that the bourgeoisie is just ultimately super, 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 super rich. Not always the case. Example that I used with my lab yesterday. How many of you have to pay a tuition to go to your high school? Fair enough. That's a lot of capital that your parents have that they can spend in extraneous education that is not like the normative, publicly owned or government facilitated things. Okay? Capital is the social wealth or property accumulated in any given society, often used to obtain power or status. Okay? So, tuition example, right? If you've ever heard another adult ask your parent, right, well, what school do you send them to? As opposed to like a public school or whatever, right? That is both social capital and a demonstration of their actual wealth, right? Maybe that's not why they're saying it. Maybe that's not why they're sending you there, but you get what I'm sort of saying. Capital is worthless without workers to operate and exchange them for commodities. What is a commodity? Google it if you must. Penelope.
Physical goods.
Sure, physical goods. Anything else?
Something that's usually like bought or sold or traded.
Bought, sold, or traded. Yep. Exchanged for power, capital, what have you. Yes. Relevant for this conversation because of the overlap and the interconnectedness. Racial capitalism. 1. All capitalism is racial capitalism. More specifically, racial capitalism is the process of deriving social and economic value from and at the expense of the racial identity of another person. So, example. Thoughts? Caitlin. Slavery. The key concept here is that capitalism demands the exploitation and the making expendable of the working class. this is giving very crash course MD, and I'm hearing you. Are there any questions about this? Things about this concept that we find confusing or frustrating? Yeah.
How would capitalism work once we reach a state of automation?
Interesting. What do you mean by automation?
Just like if we assume that capitalism demands exploitation of the working class, a lot of like techno future whatever people are like eventually there is not going to be really a working class because like robots. And then does capitalism like find a new way to function or does it like cease to exist?
A lot of theoretical debate about that. Personally, I do not believe, given the state of our economy and also the way that racial capitalism demands the exploitation of a working class or demands a working class, that like automation, right? Like someone has to, I don't know, make said AI. First of all, I don't know if any of us have seen iRobot, but Will Smith said no. I'm not convinced. It's not worth it. I'm very concerned about the state of the things. But I'm sure that the techno-futurists who are like, this is going to happen would say that, you know, this is why we should fully automate. We need to do all of these things because then it eliminates the working class and we can But in order to develop that technology and that AI, someone has to be exploited. So where do we get the materials to achieve that automation? Caitlin?
We get it from like we had the word yesterday, but I can't say on top of my head. Like people from the global south, for example, we still have to extract resources from there and exploit people to get those resources. So even if like i.e. automation says that people don't work in factories anymore, either the people who used to work in those factories become houseless and therefore have to work in different jobs that are like relatively more exploited, and also we still extract resources from like countries and exploit them for their workers to get them. So automation is just kind of like a redress of like the capitalism that we see now. People are still gonna be exploited and sad and really tired, and yeah.
Sure. So, like, other example, right? Not everyone in the South during slavery, right, has insert traditional job, right? Like, women literally could not have jobs, still needed capital, social, physical wealth, what have you. So, like, other thing to consider here, too, and I think Caitlin sort of points this out, right, is that even if automation is fully achieved, right, to be the proletariat or the working class means the buying and selling of one's own labor power, right? Labor to be exploited or to make money. And so, and I'll get to this on a later slide, but that is to say that, like, okay, do people stop needing money in a world where, like, everything is fully automated? Like, do people stop needing to buy food, pay their rent, all of those things? Does that go away under techno-futurist model? To be honest with you, I'm genuinely asking because I don't read those books, but I'm hearing you, right? And so, thoughts?
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead.
Usually what like most traditional Marxists say is they'll just become like the London proletariat, just because they don't have jobs, but they'll still be homeless and all.
Sure, but also they might find other ways to sell their labor. So, might resort in like, you have to sell, I don't know, your body. You might have to sell your house or physical space that you might have left, like if you do have space in your home, what have you, right? But other things become commodities depending on, you know, their social value or the material conditions that you're situated within, right? So those are all things to consider. But yeah, that is not genuinely my cup of tea, but those are my thoughts about automation. Please see iRobot film, circa 2009. Very, very relevant. The bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. Didn't I say there would be another slide? Aren't you so grateful for me? Okay. The bourgeoisie, those who own and profit off of the privately owned. The privately owned means of production and capital. The bourgeoisie is often responsible for weaponizing the state, occupying it, making it impossible to access, right? To weaken and eliminate any attempt at proletarian liberation. Okay? So think overseers on plantation. White men, equally poor, destitute, without capital, without resources, without slaves, but who have been convinced, right, that they have an economic and social vested interest in the continued subjugation and ownership of slaves, Because maybe one day, if they do a good job and they impress said landowner, they will be gifted slaves, or they will rise up, they will pull themselves up by said bootstraps, okay? But to be the bourgeoisie means to be able to sort of move within and to utilize or extend the social fabrics, the structural fabrics of society in your favor. It means having the ability to maneuver the structure in such a way that you can still protect and continue to own and encourage people to also feel vested in your own self-interest. The proletariat is functionally the opposite. Those who own no capital and must sell their labor power to the bourgeoisie in order to survive. So we have to pay rent, right? We have to pay a mortgage. We have to pay a light bill. We have to buy Wi-Fi. Not a need, but you see what I'm saying. We have bills to pay. The way that we've been conditioned to pay those bills is to take a bunch of AP classes, to then do debate, and a bunch of other extracurriculars, and then go to college. And then when you go to college and you grind a little bit more, grind a little bit more while you're all poor because you're taking a full course load, maybe you'll get a degree. And that degree will be exchanged in the market with a company for a job and a purpose, where you have to meet more deadlines, and then you pay more bills, and you pay more dues, and you grind, until you get your really, really bad check. Asia, that's so sad. I agree. I'm hearing you. It's a lot. It's aggressive, but it's real life. Yeah.
What is the difference between when we talk about fungibility and someone doing labor? Like, what kind of is that line, or is it intertwined?
Good question. So, can you define fungibility for your peers?
That's crazy.
I'm hearing you.
Fungibility, when something can be used in multiple purposes or be utilized for multiple things, because I guess in context of pest, it has become dehumanized so much that we can kind of put it in certain situations and say, do this-ish.
Sure. So very literally, which would make it easy to see the overlap between what it means to be made fungible and to be made like a laborer, or for one's labor to be extracted. But it also sort of refers to the way that value can be given to certain things and equally and easily taken away from those things. And then this is pretty relevant in terms of what we were talking about here, because obviously there's a lot of different studies of anti-blackness, and also, the way that relates to the accumulation of it as capital, right? So for the sake of our conversation, right, slaves had to be stripped of their value or stripped of the ability to be seen as human so they could be extracted from to the utmost profitable extent. Okay, but not every way that labor and value of slaves was extracted in a purely economic sense. Fungibility speaks to that sort of external extraction that's happening, i.e., right, the way that sometimes pleasure was extracted from enslaved women by master, right? So it extends beyond an economic sense. Some, Marxist insert or people who view slavery purely in an economic sense would say that sort of non-consensual sexual relation between a slave master and a slave, right, was economic insofar as it yielded more slaves. Insert the creation of the one-drop rule or the mother rule, right? If your mother was black, you were therefore a slave. Because obviously, white women in the house are not sleeping with slaves, and if they are, it does not yield the same benefit, viewed differently in the context of history or whatever. But so fungibility speaks to the ability of one to both give and take value on a whim, to alter the sort of power and the access that thing has, for very layman's terms. This term is also used very differently throughout different types of literature, and different discussions of critical race theory / theories of anti-blackness, what have you. But yeah. the result of this, both of these two things and their relationship, right, is a constant struggle between the classes. The bourgeoisie struggling to exploit the proletariat as much as possible and having to evolve with material conditions to be able to continue to do so, right? So to some degree, that sort of like techno-futurism question that's posed earlier, right, by, remind me your name again? Fiona, right, sort of gets to this, right, is that capitalism demands that the bourgeoisie, should that happen, find new ways to exploit the proletariat, right? Because in theory, right, if AI or if, you know, the other things, right, got rid of the need of a working class, right, we would probably need to find new ways to exploit them, right? Contrarily, right, the proletariat, right, is struggling as much as possible, right, to end and alleviate their own oppression. This is the constant push and pull. Do we see the struggle anywhere in the generic? Example. You're good, but also others. Also okay if you pull up said generic, but something to think about. Oh my god, I hope that our friends that are still missing are okay.
Oh wait, they're probably asleep. I'm not gonna lie. To be honest. Wait.
As we speak.
Paris. What's up, brother? Will we sleep? Okay. Wait. No, what exactly am I thinking of? It's just she's not there.
Okay. Sit on that. Risica.
We're asking for examples of the result of the struggle between classes.
Yeah, where do we see the struggle between classes?
In the workplace, the elites and then the working classes.
Sure, the elites and the working class, facts, right? These are fancy words for both of those things. I agree, yeah.
In unions.
Sure, unions, I'm hearing you. I agree with that. Other thoughts? Fiona?
To a certain extent, democracy.
Facts. I'm hearing you. I'm hearing you about that. Any other thoughts, suggestions from others? Here, actually, let me write these down before I forget them, actually, because we'll come back to this. So we said, these markers are apps. So you said democracy. No, literally did not write at all. Hello? Hello? Oh my god, German. They pay how much in tuition?
It's $90K a year.
Not you Googling it. Okay, democracy.
Liberal democracy?
All democracy is liberal democracy. No, but fair enough. I'm hearing you. Parentheses. Lol. Okay, what else did we say? We said elite, be working class, functionally, different words for same thing. What was the third thing someone said?
Unions.
Sure. I'm gonna put a star next to that because fair enough. Alright. So we have this divide, this constant struggle. Definitely creates a lot of conflict, if you will. Because you have people who are trying to maintain their ownership over their things, both for survival, but also just out of like, remember that line, one, take, hearing you. Okay? So, we have these two categories. How do these things relate to blackness? Or rather, how does blackness get situated in these categories? Blackness exists in multiplicities. Okay? What might I mean by that? We'll follow up.
Well, different forms and there's different ways to theorize what exactly blackness is.
Yeah, it exists in different forms. People relate to it differently. People experience black experiences differently, regardless of if we are both black. I'm sure me, Risica, Caitlin, Mafoloa could all explain our experiences about that differently. This idea comes from many different black academics, some non-black academics, unfortunately, and theorists. This is demonstrated in literature and in life. Okay? To demonstrate this, here are a couple of definitions, if you will. Blackness is coterminous with slaveness. This is from Frank Wilderson.
Frankie B.
Aggression. To be black is to exist in exchange without being a party to that exchange. Slavery. Being black means belonging to a state that is organized in part by its ignorance of your perspective. A state that cannot know your mind. But it's Jared Sexton. And last, my girl, a past that has yet to be done, and the ongoing state of emergency in which black life remains in peril. That's D.L. Hartman.
Ooh, I just got an example in my head about like this, but
Ilion,
finally,
let me message really quick.
when like I've been reading Beloved, and the way that like Setha kind of fights on like metaphysical levels of anti-blackness and capital throughout the entire book, and like the way that she's considered brave or like not normal, not only for like, of course, sorry if it's a spoiler, killing the baby, but also like wanting to love her babies and not see them as like commodities, at the ways that like slave masters have seen her babies as commodities and like chooses to love them. Example in my head.
Heard.
What is it called?
Beloved.
Very good novel by Toni Morrison.
Yes, Toni Morrison cooked every single time.
Facts. Blackness can also be defined and understood as the relationship between black people. And I highlight this because in debate, this is often how it is used. Okay? Both in and outside of debate. Universal experiences, or the way that some things are always relatable but never exactly the same. There is a difference, though, between blackness as an experience and black people. Okay? The reason this creates sort of a distinction, not necessarily the last distinction I described, but rather the reason this is relevant or creates sort of uniqueness or specificity in context of like the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, right, sort of begins with, I think, the Sexton quote, right, which is to say that blackness begins in the U.S. as capital rather than a person who is selling their labor power by choice, in quotation marks. Right? So blackness is not, laboring in exchange for survival, okay, or in exchange for capital. They're not getting paid. They're not able to make rent, right? They're literally reduced down to the labor that they can produce or that their bodies yield, right? So this line about to be black is to exist in exchange without being party to that exchange. Blackness is constantly in relationship to this struggle or existing between this struggle of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, but never accessing either of those positions. Questions? Infinitely more definitions of blackness that could be found, discussed, dialogued over. But this is a solid, if you will, starting point. So, what is property? We've defined capitalism, we've defined blackness to some degree. What is property?
Like stuff you can own.
Sure, stuff you can own. Sure. Other thoughts?
An idea or a like physical thing that you can take ownership of or exploit or capital.
Physical / ideas to be exploited in exchange for capital. Sure. Loving that, very definition like. Other thoughts?
Does it need to be for capital in terms of like what is just reference? Because I feel like it's often is.
Sure. Could you think of an example where it's not?
No.
Fair enough.
I think, like, when
I'm willing to entertain. I'm willing to dialogue and deliberate. We can theorize in the room.
I think like it's also connected to social capital. This idea, because like for example, I use the idea like Native Americans had slaves because of like social capital reasons. The idea that if I have slaves, I will not be enslaved is kind of what I think about. Like our ideas of like being able to own Black people as a means of saying like I am not Black and I own this thing, so I'm able to like access whiteness in some ways and be protected by that access to whiteness. So I think like capital kind of works hand in hand when we talk about property and with anti-Blackness, because it's always predicated off this idea of being able to own like Black people as a means of accessing whiteness in some way, even if it's not like genuine whiteness. Like to have some type of like gain or ownership of something. Yeah.
Sure. I'm not mad at that either. Defined it earlier also, but capital should be thought of as, the social, economic wealth and power constantly to be accumulated. Because what if you run out? You always need more. So,
More. DDA.
right, more.
DDA, please.
What is property? Owning and accumulating always. Property, a system of rights, norms that give people control over things of value, i.e. capital that is owned. In the context of this year's resolution, / also more specifically, private property is a social relationship in which the property owner takes possession or ownership over anything another person or group produces with said property. Let me think of an example.
Your factory,
Okay, explain further.
well, the people working in the factory will produce goods that the owner of the factory gets to have full control over, like the sale of and take all the profits from.
Facts. What is that called when one is producing maybe a part of a product or some of it, but they don't get to sell it, or they do not have any sort of relationship to the actual exchange of said product? We talked about this yesterday in lab, my children. Yes?
Alienation.
Alienation! Capitalism demands it. What can we be alienated from? Thoughts? Yes?
Our labor.
Your labor.
Our choice, like how we talked about yesterday, that certain things we have to do to survive.
Facts. Alienated from our choices, right? Our autonomy, sure. Alienated from oneself.
Species being.
You said what?
Species being.
Sure, species being. Facts.
That's that LB, bro. What?
Yes. Also the theory, bro, but facts. I'm hearing you. Yeah.
You can be alienated from other people.
From others, i.e. like individualism, this idea that we need to protect and preserve ourselves and our property to survive. We're not concerned, or we are not often thinking about or having a vested interest in other people's survival, excuse me.
I guess also like happiness and mental health, like you gotta be on the grind no matter how you're feeling.
Yep, exactly. So to be alienated from oneself, species being, right? Okay. When we say species being, it's literally species / being, not like that is one word or one terminology, by the way. Questions about this? Okay, so property, we're owning, we're accumulating. From people to property. Okay, first of all, where is my picture? Racist. Hold on. like making sure, so it's gonna make it. There we go. What was I say? Rude. Okay, alas. Black Marxist Kevin Rashid Johnson explains that the empire, or the US, I talked to my group about this yesterday, imperial core, right, has been able to successfully push capitalism as the only viable option. Explains it was the lust for profits and the dollar that was behind the kidnapping and enslavement of our African ancestors to begin with. So when we think about property, right, and the ownership of things, so much of the way that we own things, why we own things, why we feel we need to accumulate so much of it, right, comes from the United States' origins and foundations in slavery. And also should inform and become context for how we view our relationship to other nations, right, or other bodies of people external to the U.S. now, right? Because the U.S. cannot accumulate labor power in the same way through labor through slavery, cannot accumulate bodies, wealth through exploited work in the same way, because obviously we no longer have chattel slavery. This is constantly evolving, right? Turning people into property, what they produce into property, with very little regard for the way that that situates them in a larger structure, their health, all of the things. Consider the Constitution, right? Function to ensure and protect the liberty and the property interests of class elites. Established and became foundational to solidifying, right, classes to begin with. Intergenerational differences, economic differences, social differences, and specificities. All synonymous and intertwined with the institution of slavery. Slavery equals the ultimate capital accumulation, both for and at the expense of one's labor. What might I mean by that? Not my children. How might slavery be an example of accumulation of capital both for labor and at the expense of labor? Yes?
Because it's not only taking or it's not only like using people's means to generate more capital, but also isolating them from any appreciation of value.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Very good example. Someone from my group, what do you think? Yes?
Okay, so the conversation about fungibility, like the way that we have positioned Black people, where we can strip them away from like all, or like alienate them from not only like, of course, the other people that they were around, i.e. their children, their husbands, their wives, all of that stuff, and strip them away from like moral values in a way, or like see them as being stripped away from moral values and force them to work, where like you have no say in what you can do, but you are just gonna work. Actually no, labor. And if you're not doing that, not only are you still less of a human, but we're able to take you and just make you work more because we've kind of like brainwashed you to think that you are less than a human, and so you just work and you work and you work. So you make a big profit, or labor, or so you make a big profit off of people literally being extrapolated from their humanism because they are trained to believe that this is the only way that they can do this thing, or the only way that they will be able to have some type of value. and therefore you take from them and you gain a bunch of stuff because they're like, I can just do this one thing and I'm gonna be seen as good for massa.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. Mafola and then Eli. Did you have your hand up?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know if this is exactly the question you're asking, but I guess the idea of accumulation and how it has to do with slavery is like kind of the notion of false meritocracy post-slavery. So it's like white people had a bunch of capital that they accumulated over hundreds of years, and so it's like 5 billion steps ahead, as opposed to like post-slavery, black people did not have the option to like have that accumulation in the first place.
Okay, so first of all, facts, right? Because then that means what in the context of our topic, right? Like now it means that a certain group of people has a head start and has an easier time owning ideas, producing ideas, but also they have more external value, property, capital, or disposable income, if you will, so they can kind of sit back and spend time having ideas, right? So if you're rich, right, you can take a year off from college or working to brainstorm and to like develop the Dell computer or Apple or whatever. You can sit and invent ideas because you have the capital, the ability to do so, because you're not worried about paying bill, right? So sure, that gets at it a little bit. Mafola, what were you gonna say?
Yeah, I was gonna say the idea that the reason, kind of like what Johnson said, that white people outlined that this is what they needed to do, there was specific labor they needed to do, however, because they felt that they were too big per se to do said labor, they extracted said labor from other people to get whatever they needed from that labor.
Sure. So sort of what I'm getting at here, right, about the ultimate capital accumulation, both for and at the expense of labor, is also to some degree the sort of contradiction, or one of the first or earliest contradictions of both capitalism and also the way that slavery operates, or why slavery is like a unique instance of this accumulation, right? Because we are both accumulating slaves for their labor, or for labor in general, but also treating them and dealing with them in such a way that also inhibits their ability to labor to an extreme degree, right? So like the sort of like confusing behavior of, you know, slave masters, property owners, to like beat slave within an inch of life means they cannot work the next day, right? But in hopes that that demonstration of violence makes other workers or laborers more efficient, won't run away, won't go against, you know, the demands of said property owner, of said slave, or what have you, right? And so these contradictions demonstrate sort of another core concept of capitalism, which is to say that capitalism exists in contradictions, right? And demands a constant reassessment of the way that it functions given our material conditions. So when I say material conditions, what would I be referring to, right? The world that we live in. The things that make up our lives, the things that inform our economy, the things that inform how we are able to access certain goods, certain needs, wants, what have you, right? Physically, where are we located, right? Imminent critique, correct. Right? It matters, right, that black people, new African population, right, are stolen from another continent, right, and a series of cultures, and then are displaced and put on a new land where they have zero familiarity, means less likely to run away. Like, there's a reason we did not choose or did not try to continue enslaving indigenous folk, right, in the Americas, on Turtle Island, what have you, because it wasn't strategic, did not make sense. They knew the sort of material location, the layout of the land, the things like that. Does not mean it didn't happen, but is important and informs the way that that sort of like superstructure is able to manifest itself. Reddick Smalls explains that all of the laws and the judicial interpretations, including the intellectual property clause and its resulting legislative progeny, right, were designed to favor capital acquisition at the expense of free labor at its inception. Corollary judicial interpretations or relating judicial interpretations of and about labor engendered a constant tug of war. Remember the like struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, right, on the use of the intellectual property laws to both incentivize creation and award the creators for their efforts. So even though, right, we hear things all the time in like the general media, like it's risky to become an entrepreneur or to become an inventor or to take a break, all of those things, people are often encouraged, right, to think about privatize or sell their ideas, not for the goodness of their heart or because they want to do something good, but because it's a way, another thing for them to sell to ensure their survival, right? So example that was given the other day, right? My lab was talking about the creation of insulin, right? And the way that big pharma has sort of monopolized the creation of different drugs that are needed by a lot of people, but for whatever reason, right? We read all these cards about innovation is good. It means that we create more vaccines, solves disease, solves pandemics, whatever, right? But at the same time, we're innovating so many of those like drugs, so much of that, like those vaccines, what have you, and people still can't access them, right? But the inventors of insulin, right, they sold that idea for like $1 because they were like, I want this to be accessible. Not what happened. Hundreds upon thousands of different people cannot access their insulin daily, or it's being changed because it's being innovated. And so, well, this insulin is more profitable, easier for us to market, easier for us to produce, means that we're going to stop selling this insulin. Well, what if that's the only insulin that works for me? Now I have to test new insulin, new product on my body, hope I don't get sick, hope I don't have, flare up, what have you. So common thoughts about, or common mentions of, blackness as property or being understood as property. Insert Dred Scott decision, rant, okay? Slave, not person, but slave. Cannot own property or litigate the theft of their own property. Cannot litigate on their own behalf. Blackness as property, right, as foundational to the United States, influences many of the social relations that we still interact with in society today. So even though debate has turned some of these examples about like the afterlife of slavery as just, well, that's just an example, right? Like it's contingent, it's not whatever, right? We need to think beyond, right, of debates flattening of discussions of blackness as just being pests, right? But as a very complicated and very intimate, instantiation of rights, lack thereof, right, of one's labor, right? This should sort of operate as a lens for understanding the way that capitalism is constantly evolving, right? Class, racial, gender dynamics all come from the foundational logic of blackness as property. So another example, right, is that masculinity, origin story, okay, the way that we understand what is masculine and what is feminine is predicated off of whiteness's relationship to blackness. Azja, what do you mean by that? Right? So, for example, white masculinity, right, is defined by one's ability to protect its feminine counterpart. Azja, what do these binaries mean? I agree. They're fucked up. Who's to say? Noted, but we're talking about origins here. Okay? To be feminine is to be subservient and feeble and to be in need of protection from white masculine entity. Protected from what, might you say? Right? Oftentimes, black masculine, black other, what have you. White masculinity is defined by being able to protect and accumulate one's property, i.e. women, right? Protect it from black, dangerous other, what have you. So, blackness often, and still struggling today, right, cannot access labels such as masculine or feminine Because what is one thing black man, black masculine subject could not protect black feminine subject from?
Being sexually assaulted by
The white man.
white men.
I agree, because obviously slave master could do with what he pleased with his property. Yes.
Is this like kind of like what happened with like Emmett Till?
Very good example, actually. Yeah. We all know the story of Emmett Till? Yes?
Yes.
So, thank you for being honest. Boy from Chicago goes visits family in the South. Okay? In a store, minding his business. What he does is still very unclear because this woman later admits that she lied. But white woman accuses this young boy, very young, of dog whistling at her. Dog was like, was it catcalling, what have you? Catcalling her, but accuses him of, verbally assaulting her in store. She runs, she tells her husband, brother, uncles, what have you. And all of these men find out where he is staying. They knock on the door really late at night. His family, terrified because of lynch law, what have you, right? They have nothing they can do. These white men come into their home and take him away. And he ends up being murdered, and they find him, floating in the river, next day, a couple days later, what have you. Very, very knowledgeable story. If you Google it, there's, images of his face. It's foundational to, a lot of critiques. A lot of people say it's the start of the civil rights movement, or it becomes, a very large catalyst for the civil rights movement. Emmett's mother's choice to, display his, body to the public, what have you. But relevant to the thing that I just described, because white masculinity manifests in, I need to protect, insert white woman from what? 12-year-old boy? Well, he's a black boy, so yes. Right? I need to assert dominance and create power. I need to accumulate social power, social wealth, right? Social respect, dominance, whatever, through the subjugation of a subservient class that lacks the power to do anything about it, right? Slavery in its afterlife demanded, right, the pillaging and the theft of any black attempts at establishing and maintaining one's property. Yes.
We, when we're doing research, we looked at, how not only were black people unable to get patents because, of, laws, but also lynching would, literally, white people would go and, lynch black inventors to, keep them away from getting patents, as a means of, keeping white people to have, only access to those types of laws.
Facts. Agreed. Same author I referenced before, Brenda Reddick Small, says that during slavery and its aftermath, Jim Crow, segregation, mass lynching, right? Very much what Caitlin is describing. To be competitive, people would steal ideas, literally steal property, refuse to give property that was promised, right? To further create this divide between those who already have, regardless of post-slavery, and those who do not have.
40 acres in a union.
Sure, facts. IP laws were conceived in a world, right, and framed, right, pursuant to a constitution where slavery was always sort of informing everyone's decision making. So it is hard to disentangle, right, the notions and the origins of IP and the owning of one's property and slavery, and the way that slavery informs what property ownership is and what owners are allowed to do, right? So very heavily interconnected. So when we evolve, our economy evolves, or our society evolves, right, to caring more about one's ideas, maybe not one's physical property or physical invention, right? Everyone's always creating content, right? In a world of communication technology, right, at its core, it is about the ability of humans or people to interact, implement, adapt, right, and exploit that technology to their gain, or to make good content, or to be in ownership of that content, right? Who has the ability to disseminate and create those things, right? So, modern example, right, when Black girl invents TikTok dance dance gets added to Fortnite, no credit, nothing, what have you, okay? LOL Asia, you can laugh at the Fortnite example if you want to, but I grind, okay? So, challenge me if you wish, but you're not gonna be happy. That's all I have to say about that. Okay, we're talking 40 bombs here, okay? If you don't know what that means, play Fortnite, you'll get it, okay? The legal regimes that govern, right, all of these, activities all interact or are interdependent on component parts of the things. Why did it go back? Hello? No, it didn't. It was there. We're good. So, diving a little bit deeper here, and then we'll be done and I'll let you ask questions and you can leave, is the Patent Act of May 1790 was first patent-based legislative act to be born from the Constitution's intellectual property clause. This first act and its progeny all embody the same underlying notion, that the patent laws confer on a patentee the power, right, to exclude all others from making or using or selling his invention, right? So again, the ability to own and what it means to own is very integrated into what the United States, what the Constitution deems as having power, right? And that power is often understood and defined and informed by how slavery creates power for a certain population. And how slavery creates a sort of dynamic of like power and domination that is able to be used and then operated or exported to control other populations. Insert overseer example I said a minute ago. Right? So modern example, not assuming slavery, right, would be like it is very difficult to get people in the US, even though they are struggling, right, to see or relate to those who are struggling and who are poor and destitute in any other nation, right? Because to some degree, the only reason they're not like really struggling / houseless / whatever, can't access healthcare is because those other people are struggling. Their survival is dependent on the further exploitation of other nations, other groups of people, what have you. Right? To be able to own the idea of a vaccine ignores that the mass production of that vaccine may require the little tiny hands of children to mine the necessary materials to do that. But I need to sell this patent, I need to get this patent, I need to sell this vaccine because innovation is important and also it'll make me some money. Great, amazing. But Asia, I need this vaccine. I agree with you. But to make it efficiently and in the way that the US knows how does require exploitation to some degree. Asia, does that mean that vaccines are bad? No, did not say that. But in order for one to have power and wealth, it has to be done in such a way that demands efficiency, that demands exploitation, rather than what one would call maybe a collaborative or, a more conscious effort. Insert top 3 alternative cards in generic.
Knowledge socialism.
Screaming, yes.
How does government subsidies play into this? Because I feel like generally they're specifically made to subsidize like things that aren't efficient enough to actually profit in like the free market, but to ensure like a sense of society beneficial outcomes still exist. And like half the time that's just for farmers,
Sure.
because they're like we need to protect jobs or whatever. But like assuming it's not for that.
Okay, so good example, but who is doing the subsidizing? The state, right?
Mm-hmm.
The state oftentimes is subsidizing or creating subsidies or incentives, if you will, right, for people to innovate or do particular things, maybe to decrease warming or whatever. But that subsidy might require, I don't know, the use of a certain, what's it called? Like, what did they use to kill like bugs and shit? I don't know. A certain chemical on their land, or you need to use a certain type of soil or whatever. Okay? And that, subsidy or whatever, like that, I said this last night, QBQ, but that certain requirement, right, happens at the expense of, other country, wherever we get said thing from, right? Like, yes, government subsidies may help those in the U.S., but that requires, again, a parasitic relationship upon other nations. And we have to cut back somewhere. And we do export jobs, we do export labor to other nations, other countries, what have you, right? Which means that's like, okay, so why is the U.S. somehow like in a world where we can't sacrifice a little bit of our military and we have nowhere to cut back and we're cutting education programs? Where the F are they getting this money to subsidize? Finding cheaper labor somewhere else, right? Getting cheaper materials or finding new materials and other things that we did not have before because we decided to like intervene in X nation and steal all of their wealth.
Right.
So it's like people are like, oh yeah, government subsidies, da da da. It's like awesome, right? How are you able to do that? Right? I don't know. It's a lot. Okay. Questions, comments, concerns. Giving very much crash course. I could talk a billion more hours about this, as Turner joked before I started, and it is already 58, I think. 10 o'clock. I have to start the next lecture. But, questions? No.
Are there like any like pieces of literature, like books, articles, papers that you recommend as like
Settlers by J. Sakai. J.Sakai. This book right here, I cannot find an online version of it, but Panther Vision by Kevin Rashid Johnson, very good book. Night Vision by Butch Lee and Red Rover. All very good texts about just like some of the like, it's very like easy to understand, but all good texts describing sort of the social relationships and the way that we sort of relate to one another in when we are all sort of suffering or struggling in this like, you know, transient bourgeois versus proletariat regime. But all very, very good books, texts that I would recommend, and all easy to understand, not super high theory, just like very much written so the working class who doesn't have time to do all this high theory shit can understand. So like I definitely recommend those.
okay, thank you.
Absolutely.